This video is the first in a series where I'm going to be talking about some practical strategies for writing poetry. Now I'm going to be focusing on formal poetry that rhymes and has a meter rather than free verse poetry, but some of these techniques will apply to both, especially in some of the early videos where I'm just talking about some very basic writing techniques. Even if you're not interested in formal poetry and just want to write free verse or prose, some of these videos could still help you to become a better writer. Now the first thing I want to talk about is not any specific nuts and bolts stuff about writing poetry. I will get to that later in this video, but before we start delving into any techniques, we need to talk about a basic principle and get our headspace right. And for our first rule of poetry, I'm going to turn to the epic poet, James Sale, a guy who's been writing poetry for over 50 years and knows what he's talking about. He is actually my mentor. And James has this advice to give. He writes, "This sounds obvious but isn't. Always aim for beauty. Poetry should be and is beautiful, but much of what passes for poetry today is exactly the opposite. It's ugly, it's victim Latin, it's just political posturing, and worst of all, it's just chopped up prose." So, aim for beauty. I want to break this down. Now, I'm calling this my first rule, but in James's Poetry Circle newsletter, it's actually his 13th rule for how to write good poetry. This issue of the newsletter just came out this month, which is partly why I'm using it, because I just read it recently. But for our purposes, this is a good place to start. Now, if you're really serious about wanting to get better at writing poetry in a short period of time, I would recommend subscribing to James's Poetry Circle newsletter. It will give you a lot of useful practical tips and wisdom, and best of all, it's totally free and costs you nothing. I have a link to the Poetry Circle newsletter in the description to this video at the top, so you can click that and it will take you directly to James's English Cantos website where you can subscribe. Back to our topic though. I'm saying aim for beauty because it gets us in the right headspace. Like James said, this is not an obvious principle today. It's actually very unfashionable to believe this. In his book, The Arts of the Beautiful, philosopher Etienne Gilson says this: "Art creates beauty. The beautiful is a transcendental of being, and to approach being as such is always to reach the threshold of the sacred." Basically, Gilson is saying here that beauty is real and accesses a higher spiritual realm, which is kind of a new restatement of an old idea. Gilson was a specialist in medieval philosophy, so he's citing Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, and of course, Augustine himself drew on Plato, so this idea that art can access a transcendental realm goes all the way back to the Greeks. If you know anything, you've probably heard this idea before in some form. And maybe when you look at a great work of art or listen to great music or read great literature, this is something you may have felt yourself. Now, maybe you haven't. Maybe you don't agree with that idea. Maybe you think it's false. And if you think it's false, I would say that you've either been going to school for too long or maybe had some horribly traumatic childhood experience and you never got over it and you think life is just awful. While I myself had a happy childhood, I did go to school for too long, and so I can relate to that. I used to believe that myself. But whether you think this principle is true or false, the way that you see the world is ultimately going to reflect the kind of art you create. People who have a very despairing philosophy create despairing art and write despairing poetry. We see this a lot in the modern literary landscape of the past 100 years. Art has become very depressing and pessimistic. In our postmodernist, postcolonialist, post-whatever intellectual landscape, if you're a deconstructionist who thinks there's no meaningful distinction between the binary oppositions of ugliness and beauty, then you're going to create art that reflects that. And I can guarantee you that in the eyes of the average person, they will not think you're deconstructing beauty. That person will just think your work of art is ugly. Because it is. No matter how many prestigious grants you're getting or how many museum curators applaud you, your painting or your poem is actually a piece of crap. It's very unlikely to have any of those qualities that Benjamin Weicker and Jonathan Witt identified as the four common elements of artistic beauty: depth, harmony, elegance, and radiance. On the other hand, if you believe beauty is real, if you believe truth is real, if you believe that God is not just a sky daddy enthroned on a hierarchy of oppressive patriarchal systems, but actually represents a moral order to the universe, then you're much less likely to create art that is angry and embittered and depressing. You're much more likely to create art that is enjoyable to look at or read or listen to, like art in the Italian Renaissance or English literature in the Elizabethan age. Art that does have that depth, harmony, elegance, and radiance. Art that people will like. So the takeaway here is if you want to create something beautiful, something lasting, something the future will care about, You need to do what artists of the past did before the West started to hate itself. You need to create beauty, not ugliness. Don't make fake art. But in any case, you don't have to analyze this on a deep level or have some kind of intricate theory of beauty in order to aim for the beautiful in your poetry. You just need to have an intuitive understanding of what beauty is and to not have that innate idea corrupted by a bad education. Can you remember a moment when you were a child and you saw something beautiful? That's literally all I'm talking about. Just don't lose that sense of wonder. And if you have lost it, recapture it. Philosophy begins in wonder, as Plato said, and that also applies to poetry and the other creative arts. If you're starting from a place of bitterness or resentment, that is not going to create something of value. Now, this leads us up to the question of what does this idea actually look like when you're writing poetry? In other words, what is beautiful language? To answer this question, I want to contradict two common dogmas of poetry writing today. And both of these are interrelated. One kind of follows from the other. Beautiful language doesn't necessarily mean using a lot of flowery words for their own sake. Shakespeare can be very verbose in his sonnets and plays, but he also knew what he was doing. And if you're just starting out writing and you're trying to use a lot of big words to sound fancy, probably it's going to come off as showy and affected. So you're best off aiming for the simple. But that also doesn't mean writing in a grade school vocabulary like Ruby Core and a lot of Insta poets do today. That kind of poetry isn't just simple, it's also simplistic, which is a different thing. If you're in a college-level creative writing program, an MFA program, whatever, there's very heavy pressure to write in this simplistic way, and that's because the political left that dominates academia associates minimalism in language with social equality, when those two things don't have anything to do with each other. It's an erroneous correlation. Now, Hemingway did this well, famously, in a way that was highly suggestive. His simple language expresses a lot that's under the surface that isn't being said, but most writers aren't Hemingway. And when they do that, when they go for the extreme minimalistic style, it's just boring. So my advice is when you're aiming for beauty, avoid the twin extremes of both oversimplicity on the one hand and bombast on the other. Just write in a way that sounds natural to your subject. Don't dumb your poem down, but don't put it on a pedestal either. And so to answer how do you do this, we have to look at your specific word choices. Now there's another school of modern thought, specifically with a lot of poetry written in the last 100 years, and that's that you should only use words with English roots that specify concrete things, not Latin-based words that are more abstract. This way of thinking, which is very prevalent today, is that concrete poetry is good poetry. Now my response to this is Latin is one of the largest sources of words in English, and you're cutting out a lot of your vocabulary if you never use Latinate words. Now it's true that you do want to stay rooted in particular details. You're not writing philosophy, which is about abstractions and generalizations. You're writing poetry, which is about describing particular images. Concepts and feelings should be expressed through images. Novice poets have a way of just bluntly stating their emotions and ideas, and you shouldn't do this. But a dash of the Latin or Greek can add a certain lyricism to your images. Personally, I think a mixture of the abstract and the concrete is best. The occasional Latin word used in the right way has a rather mellifluous quality. There's a good Latin word, it rolls off the tongue and is elegant and has a beautiful quality to it. In fact, words that are considered beautiful are often words that are longer like that. A scholar who studies this even suggested that beautiful sounding words are dactylic. Now that's a metrical unit that has 3 syllables where the stress is on the first syllable. If you've heard this term before, if you know anything about it, you would probably know that this was the type of meter used in ancient Greek poetry. So examples in English of this would be melody, gossamer. Mellifluous is 4 syllables, but that's kind of dactylic too. Mellifluous. You will notice that these are not very concrete words. These are all abstract. Now again, it's often in MFA programs where you're going to encounter this advice to only use concrete language in your poetry. Some very educated people may tell you this. And you need to be really wary when somebody tells you that you should never do something. Because in almost every case, when you look through history, it's not too difficult to find a counterexample of somebody who did that thing that you're not supposed to do and who really pulled it off well. Don't go overboard with Latin words, but sprinkle them in occasionally. It's a great way to end a line, especially if you're rhyming. It will be a lot easier to find other words that rhyme. Lots of Latinate words rhyme, not a lot of English root words. and it's nice to have a mix of those in your rhyme schemes. But obviously, you are going to use some concrete words in your poetry, so what should those words be? What are beautiful, concrete words? Good poetical words are words associated with nature, art, the senses, the body. Of course, with the body, it's easy to descend into the crude or disgusting, so except for the heart, stick to external features of face, fingers, feet, hips, etc. And, if you want to get saucy, find some choice metaphors for the saucy parts. A lot of award-winning poets today, they like to be very sexually explicit because, it adds to the shock value. But we live in an age where nobody is shocked by anything anymore. And I think it's the case that that kind of thing just tends to be not good. Of all of these different categories for finding beautiful words, I think nature is the best. Being around the natural world makes you feel connected to something much larger than yourself. And if you've ever looked out over a vast landscape and felt a sense of awe, a sense of sublimity, you're feeling that beauty. You're feeling the beauty of nature. Nobody ever looks into the night sky and thinks that sense of beauty they're experiencing, that feeling is socially constructed. Everybody on Earth has that same feeling. It's not culturally conditioned. Whereas people in cities are disconnected from nature. They can't see the stars because of light pollution. Not that a cityscape at night can't be beautiful too, but it's still a poor approximation to a mountain range, much less the Milky Way. But many poets, from Theocritus and Virgil up to William Wordsworth, have found nature to be a great source of inspiration in their poetry. Now, you might be like Alfred Lord Tennyson and have a more nature red in tooth and claw view, the recognition that nature is a savage place as well as a beautiful one. And, that's fine too. That's a perfectly valid viewpoint. But even if your poem isn't about nature per se, using metaphors of nature to describe human emotions and events and behaviors can be very powerful. In fact, I would say it's something that you can really almost never go wrong doing. Now, if you're trying to describe a forest or the sun or the stars, this is where the combination with abstract words can be so powerful. I should say that using adjectives is very out of fashion in modernist so-called lyrics today, as is evident if you look at Joy Harjo's poem, American Sunrise, which isn't about its title at all, but rather about indigenous people hanging out in a bar. You'll notice that in the entire poem, there are only two adjectives. A pathway is described as being firelit, which is really dull but pales in comparison to the next one, which is that the stars are described as starry. Yes, you heard that right. This poem, the most celebrated poem of a former poet laureate of the United States, uses the description starry stars. If you were in fourth grade language arts, you would probably get points for effort, and the teacher would pat you on the head and say, "Very nice, little girl," before adding, "But you should really use an adjective that's maybe a different word from the word you're describing." Anyway, what I'm advocating for is very unfashionable, again, but my advice is throw in a few abstract adjectives for the sake of beauty, especially words with L's and M's, N's, S's, V's. These letters really have a mellifluous quality. So the stars might be luminous stars. The forest might be verdant. Now, you don't want to be overly dependent on adjectives. If you are using adjectives, just use one. Don't use like 3 adjectives for one noun. And you also don't need an adjective for every single noun in your poem. Don't go overboard. But adjectives are how you describe things. And when you read a poem with a total lack of descriptiveness, there's just no beauty there. American Sunrise is a cloudy firmament. It's dark and despairing. Now let's take a good example of poetic diction. In Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun," there's a great detail where he says, "I have seen roses damasked, red and white." Damasked being a Middle English word meaning to be decorated with a variegated pattern. And it's just such a great word, it adds a richness to the poem. You'll notice that in the rest of the poem, there really aren't any other unusual words. But then towards the middle, you get this word damasked, and there's a comma afterwards, so you pause slightly to chew on that verb before moving on. And I think it adds just a great effect. This is super basic, but I think you get the point. One theory of beauty is that beautiful writing estranges us from the world. That is, it reframes how you think about something. It gets you to look at something in a new way. And this is true. You want to have that unique metaphor, but it's easy to take this too far. And I think that one error that a lot of writers make today is that they associate strangeness with being weird. And those are two different things. So don't fall into that. One writer who is great at this estrangement technique, but does it in a beautiful way that isn't weird, is Vladimir Nabokov. He's a writer who's mostly known for his prose, although he did also write poetry. He's a great example of a poetical prose writer. His prose is so carefully crafted that it becomes like poetry. Here's a description from his story, Easter Rain. In the morning, the mountains on the far side of Lake Lemon were all veiled in silky mist, like the opaque sheets of rice paper that cover etchings in expensive books. Before you heard that sentence, you had probably never thought of misty mountains as being like opaque sheets of rice paper. The best way to widen your vocabulary of beauty is, of course, just by reading a lot. And when you come across beautiful words or maybe just interesting words, write them down, make lists. James Sale advises in his same Poetry Circle newsletter to carry a notebook around so you don't forget a good thought. Notebooks are great. I myself like to do this, although I'm often caught outside when I don't have a notebook around. I don't really carry one in my pocket, but I do keep my phone on me and I take notes on my phone. And then when my note list gets too long, I will take those notes and email them to myself and transfer them to a Word document on my computer. Just documents full of brainstorming ideas. Now, in addition to reading, in order to build up a mental catalog of words to use while you're writing, sometimes you just need to refer to a resource. And in my next video, I'm going to talk about a great word tool that you can use. And no, it's not just a basic dictionary or thesaurus. It's something more cutting edge that hasn't been around for very long. But thanks for watching, and stay tuned for that.